The smoke was supposed to be the safest kind of smoke there is, a controlled burn. Low, steady flames easing through pine needles and brush the way the forestry plan demanded, keeping the land healthy and the whole county safer when wildfire season came around. I was standing on my own timber land, 500 acres I had spent years restoring, watching everything go exactly right. That's when a pastel golf cart rolled up like it owned the horizon. A woman in a crisp pink polo jumped out, eyes blazing, fingers stabbing the air as if my trees were personally offending her. She didn't ask questions. She didn't introduce herself. She started shouting about atmospheric pollutants, about HOA covenants, about how my land was lowering community standards. She said I was endangering property values. She said she would fine me until I learned respect. I let her finish, then told her one simple fact. My land was not part of her OA. She didn't argue, she smiled. A slow, confident smile, like rules bend when she says they do. 3 days later, a thick cream envelope arrived in my mailbox, stamped with an official-looking HOA seal and worded like a court summons. Inside was a fine, no warning, no discussion. That's when it hit me. This had never been about smoke. It was about control. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Gone Wild. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I need you to understand what that land meant to me before you can understand why I refused to bend, even when it would have been easier to just give her what she wanted. My name is Clay Mercer. After a long career in infrastructure and emergency management, the kind of work where every decision carries consequences and every mistake shows up later in the worst possible way, I was done with noise. I wasn't burned out. I was finished. I didn't want suburbs, neighbors 10 feet away, or a lawn that needed to impress anyone. I wanted quiet, distance, land that didn't argue back. That's how I ended up buying the Ridgewell Timber Tract, 500 acres just outside a small town called Larkspur Ridge. It wasn't famous. No tourist signs, no glossy brochures. Just a place where people still waved on back roads and the diner waitress remembered your coffee order after the second visit. The kind of town that hasn't forgotten how space is supposed to feel. I didn't buy that land to flip it or develop it. I bought it to take care of it. The property had been neglected for years before I got it. Invasive brush had taken over, fire breaks were half collapsed, and the undergrowth was thick enough that one dry summer lightning strike could have turned the whole tract into an inferno. So I did things the right way. I worked with the state forestry folks. I rebuilt the fire lines. I planned prescribed burns exactly the way they teach you. Slow, controlled, documented, and safe. Not flashy, not reckless, just responsible stewardship. And here's the part that matters more than anything. My land was not part of any homeowners association. The Ridgewell Timber Tract bordered a newer subdivision called Magnolia Crest Estates. On their side of the line, everything was polished. Stone entrance sign, curving sidewalks, identical mailboxes. Houses lined up like they'd been placed with a ruler. Their HOA ran the neighborhood like a small government, complete with rules, fines, and a board that loved reminding people who was in charge. But my property was outside their boundary, always had been. When I bought the land, I triple-checked. My closing paperwork was clear. The county plat map was clear. The deed was clean. Magnolia Crest ended at my fence line. Beyond that was mine. For a while, things stayed peaceful. Residents would jog along the edge road and nod as they passed. Kids would ride bikes up to the fence and stare into the trees like it was another world. I didn't mind any of it. I kept my gates locked, my boundary markers visible, and my business private. I wasn't trying to bother anyone, and nobody bothered me. Until early spring, when the weather lined up perfectly for a prescribed burn. Humidity was right. Wind steady and predictable. No storm systems nearby. I filed the burn plan like you're supposed to, notified the proper offices, staged the crew with water tanks, tools, and radios, and lit only what the plan allowed. Nothing rushed, nothing careless. Just low fire moving through pine needles, doing exactly what it was meant to do. That's when the golf cart showed up. A pastel thing, shiny and clean, rolling across the edge road like it belonged there. A woman jumped out before it even stopped fully. Crisp pink polo, sunglasses pushed up into her hair. Her posture wasn't curious or concerned. It was confrontational, like she'd already decided she was right. Her name was Tricia Halbrook. Though she didn't start by telling me that. She introduced herself the way authority does, not the way neighbors do. She demanded my HOA compliance number. She told me to cease and desist. She talked over me while pointing at my trees, my smoke, my land, like it was already under her jurisdiction. I stayed calm. I explained what a controlled burn was. I explained the permits. I explained that the fire was planned, monitored, and legal. I pointed to the no trespassing signs. I pointed to the boundary markers. I told her plainly that my property was not part of Magnolia Crest Estates. She didn't listen. She snapped back, sharp and loud. You don't get to make decisions that affect our community. That sentence hit harder than anything else she said. Not because it was true, but because of what it revealed. In her mind, the line on the map didn't matter. Ownership didn't matter. Law didn't matter. If something existed near her neighborhood, she believed she had the right to control it. My 500 acres weren't mine to manage. They were a problem she intended to solve. She left without another word, climbing back into her golf cart with the confidence of someone who had never been told no and meant to keep it that way. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing that sentence over and over in my head. Not shouted, not angry, certain, you don't get to make decisions. And that's when I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding that would clear itself up. It was the beginning of a fight over control, and I already knew I wasn't going to surrender an inch of land I had spent years protecting. 3 days later, the first letter arrived. Not an email, not a phone call, not even a knock on the gate. A thick envelope sat in my mailbox like a warning shot, heavier than it needed to be. Made of stiff paper, meant to feel official the moment you touched it. The seal on the front was embossed, gold and formal, the kind of thing designed to make people nervous before they ever read a word. Across the top, in bold lettering, it read Magnolia Crest Estates Compliance Division, like they were a government agency. Inside was a list of violations so confident it was almost impressive. Unauthorized smoke production. Unapproved land alteration. Failure to maintain aesthetic standards. Each line was written in that cold, bureaucratic language that pretends feelings don't exist, only authority does. They were fining me for a controlled burn on my own timber land. Land that did not belong to them. Land that had never belonged to them. At the bottom was the fine amount neatly itemized. Below that, a late fee schedule. Below that, a paragraph threatening escalated enforcement if compliance was not achieved. I laughed out loud at first. Actually laughed. The kind of laugh that comes from disbelief, like you've just been handed a parking ticket for standing in your own living room. Then I read it again, and something shifted, not fear of the money. The fine itself didn't scare me. What settled into my stomach was recognition. I'd seen this before, just dressed up differently. This wasn't confusion or ignorance. This was a process, a system, a machine built to overwhelm people who didn't have the time, money, or confidence to push back. The letter wasn't meant to be fair. It was meant to make resistance feel exhausting. So I didn't call Tricia. I didn't argue. I didn't try to reason with someone who had already decided she was right. I did the thing I'd learned to do after years, in emergency work, where facts are the only things that survive pressure. I started building a record. That afternoon, I went out and bought a thick binder, the kind meant for legal files. I labeled the spine in black marker Magnolia Crest Overreach. Not dramatic, not emotional, just accurate. The letter went in first, whole, punched, dated, and logged. I made notes in the margin about the claims they were making and where they were wrong. Then I waited. The second letter came less than a week later. Same envelope, same seal. This one raised the fine amount and added more violations. Now they were accusing me of property neglect and failure to maintain visual harmony. Visual harmony. My land was a forest. It had trees, underbrush, and wildlife. That was the point. I filed that one too. The third letter came with sharper language, more urgency, more threats. This time they claimed they could place a lion against my property if I continued to ignore community standards. That was the moment I stopped laughing completely. Because liens aren't jokes. Liens are how bullies turn paper into power. They don't have to be legal to be effective. They just have to scare people into compliance. I didn't guess. I didn't assume. I went straight to the source of truth. I drove to the county records office and pulled the certified plat map myself. I printed my deed paperwork again. I laid everything out on my kitchen table that night under the overhead light, spreading it like evidence in a trial. And there it was, plain as day. Magnolia Crest Estates ended at the fence line. My timber tract was outside their jurisdiction. Separate parcel, separate ownership, no covenants, no authority. They knew that, or at least they should have. I drafted one calm response letter. No insults, no emotion, just facts. I stated that my property was not subject to Magnolia Crest's covenants, cited the recorded plat, and demanded that they cease all contact immediately. I sent it certified mail with return receipt, the kind of paper trail that doesn't disappear. I assumed that would be enough. I was wrong. Tricia didn't back down. She escalated. Within a week, I got a call from County Code Enforcement, a real agency this time. The officer on the phone said a complaint had been filed claiming my land was an imminent fire hazard and that I was burning illegally. I could hear the script in his voice. This wasn't his first call like this. I asked who filed the complaint. He didn't say her name, but he didn't have to. That was the moment everything snapped into focus. This wasn't just an HOA trying to flex authority. This was someone willing to weaponize government systems to win a personal power struggle. Someone who didn't care if she wasted public resources, as long as she got her way. I looked down at the binder on my table, now thicker than it had been a week earlier, and understood something important. This wasn't going to stop on its own, and if I didn't handle it carefully, it wasn't just my land at risk anymore. It was my rights, my time, my peace. Tricia wasn't just annoying. She was dangerous in the quiet way bullies always are, hiding behind paper, seals, and authority she didn't actually have. And now that she'd pulled the county into it, I knew one thing for sure. This fight had crossed a line, and I was done treating it like a misunderstanding. Dale Rourke rolled up to my gate in a county truck just after mid-morning, dust settling behind him, wearing the tired expression of a man who had already solved this problem before stepping out of the cab. He didn't stride in with a clipboard like he was looking to catch me in something. He didn't glare. He didn't accuse. He leaned against the door and said, almost apologetically, "Mr. Mercer, I just need to see your burn paperwork. Someone's calling this in like it's a crisis." I nodded and handed him the folder I'd already prepared. Burn plan, notifications, permit numbers, forestry contact names, everything in order. He flipped through the pages slowly, the way someone does when they already know what they're going to find, but have to check the boxes anyway. When he reached the end, he closed the folder, let out a long breath, and shook his head. Then he said the sentence that told me everything I needed to know. "Is this Magnolia Crest again?" Again. He didn't say it with surprise. He said it with irritation, like someone recognizing a bad smell they'd encountered too many times before. Dale explained, quietly and without drama, that the HOA board leader over there had a reputation. Noise complaints, fence disputes, accusations over trash bins being out 10 minutes too long, calls made not because something was wrong, but because someone didn't like the answer they'd been given. He documented my permits, snapped a few photos for the file, and closed the complaint on the spot. Before he left, he gave me advice that sounded casual, but landed like a strategy briefing. "If they keep calling, keep sending me the records," he said. "Don't argue with them. Don't explain yourself. Let them hang themselves." That was the moment everything shifted. Up until then, I'd been reacting, responding to letters, correcting lies, assuming logic would eventually matter. But once I realized the county already saw her pattern, I understood something important. I didn't need to fight louder. I needed to fight cleaner. That week, I stopped reacting emotionally and started auditing her authority. I downloaded Magnolia Crest's HOA documents straight from their website, covenants, bylaws, enforcement policies, jurisdiction descriptions. I read them line by line, highlighting the sections that mattered. The authority clause was crystal clear. The HOA's enforcement power applied only to lots within the subdivision boundary, not adjacent land, not neighboring property, only their own. Tricia wasn't confused. She was pretending. She was acting like proximity gave her control, like if something existed near her neighborhood, she had the right to regulate it. And that realization hardened something in me. Because pretending authority is how people justify crossing lines they know they shouldn't. A few days later, the conflict crossed from harassment into something else entirely. I was checking the eastern edge of my property when I noticed fresh flagging tape fluttering in the trees. Bright pink. Knew out of place. As I followed it, I saw a survey truck parked just inside my boundary, two men walking along an old logging trace with stakes and measuring equipment. I didn't rush over. I didn't shout. I drove up slow and parked where they could see me coming. The older of the two looked uneasy the moment I stepped out. I asked, calmly, what they were doing. He hesitated, then said, "We've been hired by Magnolia Crest to mark a community access easement." That phrase stopped me cold. I asked him to show me the easement paperwork. He couldn't. All he had was a work order, signed. Authorized, issued by Tricia Halbrook. In that moment, everything snapped into focus. This wasn't about fines anymore. This wasn't about smoke. This was an attempt to create a right where none existed. To physically mark my land and later claim it had always been there. She wasn't just harassing me. She was trying to take something. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I didn't make a scene. I did something far more effective. I took photographs of every stake. The truck, the license plate, the work order with Tricia's signature. I recorded a video on my phone, stating clearly and calmly that they were trespassing on private property and needed to remove all markers immediately. The younger surveyor went pale. You could see it on his face, the moment he realized he'd been pulled into something that could ruin his career. They pulled every stake, gathered their tape, and left without argument. As I watched the truck disappear down the dirt road, I felt something settle in my chest. Tricia wasn't going to stop. People like her never do when they're caught. They escalate. They double down. They convince themselves the problem isn't their behavior. It's the resistance. That's when I made the call. I dialed Graham Pruitt, my attorney, a man who understood strategy, patience, and how power actually collapses. I told him everything. The letters, The county complaint. The survey crew. The fake easement. When I finished, there was a pause on the line. I expected anger or concern. Instead, he sounded almost pleased. "Clay," he said, "do not warn her. Don't send another letter. Don't confront her. Let her keep digging." I asked him what he meant. "We're not stopping this early," he said calmly. "We're building a record so airtight she won't be able to breathe inside it. Every move she makes from here on out is evidence, and the more confident she gets, the worse it's going to look for her." I hung up the phone and looked back at the tree line where the survey stakes had been only minutes earlier. For the first time since this started, I wasn't frustrated. I was ready. Because when someone starts forging authority they don't have, the only winning move isn't to argue, it's to let them expose themselves. Graham's plan was never about revenge. It was about containment. He told me flat out that stopping the fines wouldn't solve the real problem, because fines were just a symptom. The real issue was the power source that made Tricia believe she could bend rules, invent authority, and scare people into submission. If that power stayed intact, she'd just find a new target. To cut that power off, we needed something stronger than a cease and desist. We needed people. Which meant I had to do something I normally never do. I drove into Magnolia Crest, not to confront anyone, not to argue, not to make myself visible. I went in quietly, like someone passing through, and parked near the community mailbox station as if I were checking messages on my phone. I watched people come and go. Parents with kids, older couples, people who looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with work. And almost immediately, I noticed something that made my jaw tighten, envelope after envelope. Those same thick cream envelopes I'd been getting. Same embossed seal. Same stiff paper. People were pulling them from mailboxes, glancing inside, and shaking their heads. Some stuffed them into bags without opening them. Others read them twice, like they were hoping the words would change. This wasn't random. I approached one couple carefully, keeping my voice low, my tone neutral. I introduced myself as the guy with the timber land next door and asked, as casually as I could, whether the HOA had been giving them trouble. The woman laughed. Not the kind of laugh you make when something's funny. The kind you make when you're tired of pretending it is. That's how I met Evan and Brooke Langford. They didn't hold back. Evan told me they'd been fined for the wrong mulch color, even though it was the same shade as 3 other houses on their street. Then for visible children's toys. Then for leaving their garage door open too long while unloading groceries. Brooke pulled out a folded stack of notices so thick it could have been used as a doorstop. The worst part wasn't the fines. It was the tone. Every letter escalated. Every notice hinted at liens, at consequences, at punishment if they didn't fall in line. Tricia doesn't enforce rules, Evan said quietly. She enforces fear. I asked if they'd be willing to let me make copies. They didn't hesitate for a second. They looked relieved, like someone had finally asked the right question. Before I left, Evan leaned closer and lowered his voice. "If you're fighting her," he said, "you need to talk to Ray Cole." Ray Cole lived 2 streets over, retired Marine, flagpole in his yard, the kind of man who stands straight even when nobody's watching. Tricia had fined him repeatedly over the height of that flagpole, sent legal-sounding letters, and tried to intimidate him into compliance. It didn't work, but it wore him down. When I explained what Tricia had done to me, fines on land she didn't control, a fake easement attempt, Ray didn't get loud. He didn't rant. He just narrowed his eyes and asked one question that shifted everything. "She's using HOA money for this, isn't she?" That question mattered more than anything else said that day. Because once HOA funds are involved, It stops being a personal dispute. It becomes fiduciary duty, accountability, legal exposure. Ray told me the board never explained expenses clearly, that meetings were rushed, questions discouraged, and budget line items kept vague. Then he gave me a name: Marilyn Voss, former treasurer, retired accountant. Quit suddenly after a fight with Tricia. Marilyn didn't want to meet. She didn't want to be pulled back into the mess she'd worked hard to escape. So I didn't pressure her. I didn't call. I didn't argue my case. I delivered a folder to her front door and walked away. Inside were copies of the fines sent to me, the survey work order signed by Tricia, the county email closing the fire complaint, and one clean statement from my attorney outlining trespass and fraudulent claims. No emotion, just facts. 2 nights later, my phone rang. Marilyn's voice was calm, controlled, but there was anger underneath it. Not explosive anger, focused anger. "I've been waiting for someone to finally put this on paper," she said. Then she explained everything. Tricia had been moving money around the HOA budget like it was a personal toolkit. Vague categories, sloppy documentation, payments to vendors without proper approval, inflated legal fees, community enhancement fund that seemed to cover anything Tricia wanted it to, including, as it turned out, the survey crew she'd sent onto my land. Marilyn told me exactly what to request, exactly where to look, and exactly how to present it so the board couldn't dodge or spin it. She explained how homeowners would understand it, how numbers tell a story when they're laid out properly. When the call ended, I sat in silence for a long time. This wasn't just about boundaries anymore, or fines, or ego. I now had a financial trail, and that trail led straight to the one place Tricia truly feared. A room full of homeowners who finally understood what had been done with their money. Graham and I built the plan the same way I'd planned every safe burn on my land: slow, deliberate, and controlled. You don't light everything at once. You choose the right conditions, the right starting point, and you let the fire move exactly where it needs to go. Start small. Keep it contained. Let the heat rise in the right place. The first step was putting together what Graham called the evidence packet. Not a legal brief. Not something meant to impress a judge. This had to be something regular homeowners could understand in real time. Sitting in folding chairs with coffee in their hands. Clear, simple. Undeniable. We laid it out piece by piece. The certified plat map showing exactly where Magnolia Crest ended and my fence line began. Copies of every fine letter the HOA had sent me, stacked in order so the escalation was impossible to miss. The certified mail receipt proving I'd formally told them to stop. Photographs of survey stakes planted on my land. The survey work order with Tricia's signature. The county code enforcement email closing her complaint as baseless. And finally, a clean, easy-to-read transaction summary showing HOA funds used to pay for the survey work. No opinions, no accusations, just facts. Marilyn helped tighten the money portion until it was bulletproof. She highlighted the exact budget category Tricia had used to hide the expense and explained how it violated the board's own spending rules. She stripped away every excuse Tricia might try to use. Once the packet was ready, the next question was timing. Magnolia Crest's annual meeting was coming up in the community clubhouse. Tricia loved those meetings. They were her stage, her theater, the place she could sit behind a folding table, grip a gavel, and make grown adults feel like they were being scolded by a school administrator. Graham told me exactly what to expect. "She's going to try to block you from speaking," he said. "Good. Let her. That's part of it." The night of the meeting, the parking lot was full before the doors even opened. Cars lined the edges of the lot, headlights clicking off one by one. People walked in quietly, shoulders tense, voices low, like they were heading into something unpleasant but unavoidable. Inside, the room felt tight. Folding chairs set up in rows, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Tricia sat at the front table with 4 board members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. She had the microphone. She had the gavel. She had that practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes. The moment she saw me walk in, that smile tightened. She leaned into the microphone and said, loud and clear, "Before we begin, I want to make it known that you are not a member of this homeowners association. You do not have a right to speak here." The room went still. Graham stepped forward beside me, calm and steady. "Your board used member funds to conduct actions that expose this association to legal liability," he said. "Your members have a right to know." Tricia slammed the gavel once, sharp and loud, cutting him off mid-sentence. "No," she snapped. "This meeting will not be hijacked." That's when Ray Cole stood up from the second row. "Let him talk, Tricia," Ray said. His voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. Then Evan Langford stood, then Brooke. Then a few more people, scattered at first, then all at once. Chairs scraped softly as homeowners rose to their feet, not shouting, not clapping, just standing. For the first time since I'd met her, Tricia looked around the room instead of straight ahead, and she realized something. The room was not hers tonight. It belonged to the people she'd been squeezing for years. She swallowed, adjusted the microphone, and forced a smile that looked painful. "Fine," she said. 5 minutes. Graham leaned toward me and whispered, "Perfect. Now we light it." I walked to the front with the packet in my hands. My heart was pounding, but my voice didn't shake. I didn't start with accusations. I started with one sentence. "My property is not part of this HOA." I held up the plat map and explained the boundary. I explained the burn permits. I explained the fines. I explained that I had told the board to stop and been ignored. Heads started nodding as the pattern became clear. Then I showed the survey photos. I showed the work order with Tricia's signature. I explained that HOA funds had been used to send surveyors onto land the HOA did not own. Tricia tried to interrupt, tried to spin it as clarification and community safety. That's when Marilyn stood up. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't dramatize anything. She simply explained the budget line item and how it had been misused. The room changed. This wasn't abstract anymore. This wasn't about mulch or toys or smoke. This was about their money. Graham made the final move. He proposed a motion that forced the issue into the open, a special assessment to cover the expense Tricia had authorized. A motion that required a vote. The number was read aloud. Murmurs rippled through the room. People did the math in their heads. Ray stood again. "I move for a vote of no confidence in the entire board for financial mismanagement and abuse of authority." Even seconded it before Tricia could even respond. She tried to gavel it down, tried to claim it wasn't allowed. Marilyn calmly cited the bylaw that proved it was. When the vote came, it wasn't close. It wasn't polite. The sound of homeowners saying yes filled the room like thunder. And just like that, the fire reached the place it was meant to burn. Tricia sat frozen at the table, gavel useless in her hand, while the authority she'd built on fear collapsed under the weight of its own paper trail. I walked to the front of the room with the packet in my hands and my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my ears. But my voice stayed steady. That part surprised even me. Fear has a way of shaking people. Facts don't. I didn't start with emotion. I didn't start with accusations. I started with one sentence, clear and impossible to misunderstand. "My property is not part of your HOA." I held up the certified plat map and turned it so the room could see it. I traced the boundary line with my finger, slow enough for everyone to follow. I explained where Magnolia Crest ended and where my land began. I explained that this wasn't an opinion or an interpretation. It was recorded county fact. Then I walked them through the burn itself, the plan, the permits, the notifications filed in advance, the coordination with forestry and the county. I explained why controlled burns exist in the first place, how they reduce fuel loads, prevent catastrophic wildfires, and make surrounding communities safer. I told them the truth, that I wasn't harming their neighborhood, I was protecting it. Then I held up the fine letters. Your board has been sending me bills, I said, for actions taken on land you do not govern. The room shifted. You could feel it. People leaned forward. Murmurs rippled from row to row. This wasn't hypothetical anymore. This was something they could see. I didn't rush. I showed the survey photos next. Bright tape on trees. Stakes driven into soil that didn't belong to the HOA. Then I held up the work order. Your HOA hired surveyors to come onto my land, I said, and stake what they called a community access easement that does not exist. That's when Tricia snapped. That is a lie, she said sharply, leaning toward the microphone. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I did the simplest thing possible. I read her signature out loud. The room went dead silent. Not a cough, not a shuffle, just the sound of paper as I lowered it back onto the table. Ray Cole stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. You spent our dues on this? He asked. Tricia tried to pivot, her voice suddenly faster, sharper. She talked about boundary clarification, about community safety, about misunderstandings. That's when Marilyn stood. She didn't shout. She didn't gesture. She didn't need to. She just spoke in the calm, precise tone of someone who knows numbers don't lie. Tricia hid the survey payment under the community enhancement line, she said. That fund is not authorized for legal boundary work or third-party surveys. It never has been. Tricia's face tightened. She slammed the gavel, hard enough to make people flinch. Evan stood next. You fined us for mulch color, he said, his voice shaking with anger now. But you can spend our money trespassing. Brooke stood beside him. You threatened liens on families, she said. But you break the law and call it leadership. The room erupted. Not shouting, not chaos, but a low roar of voices talking all at once. Years of swallowed frustration spilled out in a single moment. Tricia banged the gavel again and again, but it didn't matter. The sound didn't command anything anymore. That's when Graham stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue with Tricia. He addressed the room. If the board believes this expense was justified, he said evenly, then there is a simple remedy. Present the full cost to the membership for reimbursement and approval through a special assessment. Tricia froze. She knew exactly what that meant. She knew what would happen the moment the number came out. Graham read it anyway. The total wasn't small. It wasn't something you could brush off as administrative overhead. It was big enough that every homeowner instantly calculated their share in their head. That's when Ray lifted his hand again, his voice loud and steady. I move for a vote of no confidence in the entire board for financial mismanagement and abuse of authority. Evan seconded it immediately. Tricia shouted that it wasn't allowed, that it was out of order, that the meeting was being disrupted. Marilyn calmly read the bylaw clause that proved it was allowed, word for word. Tricia's gavel came down again and again, but it was just noise now. Wood hitting wood. Authority stripped of meaning. When the vote came, it wasn't close. It wasn't hesitant. It wasn't polite. The sound of homeowners saying yes rolled through the room like thunder. In that single moment, Tricia's little kingdom collapsed. Not because someone yelled louder, not because of luck, but because paper, facts, and patience finally met the people who'd been paying the bills all along. She sat frozen at the front table, gavel limp in her hand, while the power she'd built on fear vanished right in front of her. The aftermath didn't feel like a victory lap. There were no cheers, no fist pumps, no sense of celebration. What it felt like was oxygen rushing back into a room that had been sealed shut for years. People stood in small clusters, talking quietly at first, then more freely, like neighbors again, instead of suspects waiting to be accused of something. You could see it on their faces. Relief, embarrassment. Some looked furious that it had gone on for so long. Others looked ashamed, like they'd spent years swallowing unfairness because they thought resistance was pointless. No one looked confused anymore. The fog had lifted. Tricia tried to slip out through a side door. She didn't storm off. She didn't shout. She just gathered her things quickly and headed for the exit, eyes down, like someone hoping to disappear before anyone noticed. Graham stepped into her path, his voice calm and level, the voice of someone who lives in legal reality instead of ego. "This doesn't end tonight," he told her. "The board's actions created liability. The membership will decide what happens next." She didn't respond. She didn't have to. The authority she'd relied on was already gone, and that's exactly what the room did. It decided. An interim committee formed on the spot, not through shouting or chaos, but through agreement. Ray was asked to lead it temporarily, not because he wanted power, but because people trusted him to keep things clean and transparent while the dust settled. The first actions came fast and in full view of everyone. A formal letter went out rescinding improper fines issued over the past year. People who had been quietly paying out of fear finally saw those balances wiped away. A professional audit was approved without argument. The HOA attorney contract was placed under review, along with a request for detailed billing. Vendor lists were demanded, including the survey company and a printing business that multiple homeowners recognized as being connected to Tricia's family. Most importantly for me, the HOA filed official notice that any so-called easement claims against my land were withdrawn completely. No conditions, no footnotes, just gone. The audit confirmed what Marilyn had warned us about. Spending categories so vague they could hide almost anything. Vendor payments without proper approval. Legal fees that didn't line up with the work described. Nothing flashy, nothing out of a movie. Just enough misuse and mismanagement to trigger civil action and possible criminal referral, depending on how the county wanted to proceed. The consequences were no longer theoretical. On my end, Graham moved just as methodically. He sent a formal cease and desist backed by every piece of evidence we'd collected. We prepared a complete trespass complaint packet and kept it ready in case Tricia tried anything else. She didn't. Once she lost the room, she lost her leverage. The fines stopped. The letters stopped. The threats evaporated. Because Tricia's power had never really come from the rules. It came from people's silence. Over the next few weeks, Magnolia Crest changed in ways I didn't expect. Meetings filled up instead of emptying out. Homeowners read documents instead of ignoring them. Questions were asked out loud instead of whispered in driveways. The fear that had kept everyone isolated started to crack. For the first time since the subdivision had been built, the HOA started behaving like what it was supposed to be. A service, not a weapon. And standing on my land one evening, watching the sun drop behind the tree line, I realized something else too. The fight hadn't just protected my property. It had reminded an entire neighborhood that authority only works when people believe in it. Once they stop being afraid, it has nothing left to stand on. A few months later, I stood on the same ridgeline where Tricia had screamed at me in that pink polo, and the woods were quiet again. Not empty. Not lonely. Just quiet in the way land gets when nobody is trying to dominate it. Wind moving through pine tops. Birds settling in. Fire breaks clean and healed. The kind of calm you only notice after someone stops trying to control everything around them. I didn't win because I was louder. I didn't win because I embarrassed anyone. I didn't win because I got lucky. I won because I stayed calm and treated the situation for what it really was, a simple boundary dispute that turned into an abuse of authority, backed by money, intimidation, and the assumption that no one would push back. I won't pretend it was easy. There were nights I wanted to snap, nights I wanted to march into that clubhouse and unload every ounce of anger I'd been carrying. Nights when doing nothing felt like losing. But that's what people like Trisha count on. They want you emotional. They want you rushed. They want you reacting instead of thinking. So I did the opposite. I documented. I verified. I slowed everything down. I built a record so clean and so boring that even her own supporters couldn't argue with it. Paper doesn't shout. It doesn't panic. It just sits there, waiting to be read. What surprised me most wasn't watching her lose power. It was watching an entire neighborhood remember they had it. Because the moment people stop being afraid of a clipboard, a bully doesn't have anything left to stand on. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Gone Wild. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?